Hello.
Hi, how are you? Jim Collins, how are you?
From Egypt. I think you're at the very first beginning on the other side.
On the other side.
There he is.
Hi.
I'm Matt Rakansky.
Hi, Ismail Saragildi.
Hey,
Pleasure.
Claire.
Thank you for doing
That
this.
was just all.
Pleasure.
No, sorry. Oh, yeah.
I was just calling yourself because you managed to dodge my eye. All right.
Hi, how are you?
Oh my God. Okay, are we good? We ready to go? Where was he? Here?
No, he called me.
He's going okay with his thing? Or what's that?
He's made a connection with the Santa Barbara guy from Alexandria.
Oh, let me say hello to him. Hello, sir. I'm
Hello.
Jane Harmon.
Delighted. Ismail Saragildi.
Very nice to have you here. Jim is thrilled. Just
Good.
sign it. Are we starting? No? Why? Just a reminder.
I have some certificates of appreciation for him from the librarians of the world.
Oh, that's great.
So I think you'll appreciate that. I have them right here.
No.
That's fine. But I always
Oh, wait, Ryan? Put all my stuff for Diane.
Hey, Richard. Richard.
Richard, I have a purse. No, maybe it's there. Maybe it's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
What do I? Figure it out. All right. Good.
Hey, Matt, are we going to use this or are we going to use this?
I think
I don't
since we have
care.
mics, we ought to stay seated.
Well, I think it's fine if we do. Sir,
Good afternoon.
it's good to see you.
Please take your seats.
Humbled to be next to the.
My understanding is we're live on C-SPAN, so behave yourselves. Welcome to Valentine's Day a bit early. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I can't and we can't imagine what the Wilson Center would look like today if nobody had been smart enough to put Jim Billington in charge. We'd have no Kennan Institute, no Wilson Quarterly, two projects at the heart of what we do. Who knows how many friends, how much wisdom we would have missed out on. Jim played a special role in my own education, my Russian education. We crossed paths while I was in Moscow on a congressional delegation, and he took us all on a tour of the Kremlin. Priceless. Jim, your command of Russia, its history and its culture shows up everyone here. You've forgotten more than any of us knows. Lucky for us, you wrote it all down and published it with the Wilson Center Press. Every dear friend in the room today can back me up on just how impressive you are. and there are many dear friends here. Let me just recognize a few in particular, some of whom are participating in the conversation to follow. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Jim Collins. Vartan Gregorian, the one and only Vartan Gregorian, president of the, for sure, forever, president of the Carnegie Corporation. Ishmael Sarageldin, director of the Library of Alexandria. And they're joining us to celebrate your service. We're also lucky to be joined by Latvian Ambassador to the United States, the Latvian Ambassador Andris Razans, Acting Librarian of Congress David Mao, and Jane McAuliffe, the library's Director of Outreach, and a delegate to our board. Grace McKinnon, I haven't seen Grace. Is she? There she is. Hi, Grace. Grace Kennan Warnicki, whose family has done so much to shape this institution, and Diana Davis Spencer, who has been such a friend to our work. Gatherings like this remind me just what an impact the center has. With friends and alumni around the globe, including hundreds in Russia and Ukraine, even now, we put the best scholars and the most brilliant staff to work on the most important issues. We learned that from you, Jim. You always put scholarship at the heart of our work. No one who knows you would be surprised. Some may already know this, but Jim and his daughter Susan, sitting right here, were the first father-daughter pair to win Rhodes scholarships. You can applaud for that. Throughout your service here at the Open World Leadership Center and at the Library of Congress, you've shown exceptional service to the ideal Woodrow Wilson and we all share, knowledge in the public service. It's an honor to celebrate that today with so many extraordinary individuals, including your own family, right in the front row, Marjorie, your amazing Marjorie, Tom, Susan, Katie, Sarah, and others who were not able to join us here. And I hope you're as proud as we are of what the Wilson Center has been able to build on a foundation that you laid down. Thanks for years of dear friendship with me and my late husband, Sidney, and with so many in this room, and congratulations on the example you have set for us all. It's now my delight to welcome Matt Rajansky back to America and back to the Wilson Center. In case some of you have never seen him before, he's hiding under a beard and is the director of the Kennan Institute. And we're very proud that he's here, and he will say a few words. And I also obviously have to recognize Blair Rubel, whom I'm sure will be introduced, who was the long-standing director of the Kennan Institute and is now our vice president for programs. So please welcome home Matt Rajansky.
Okay. Thanks, Jane. I seem to recall there was this line in the job description for director of the Kennan Institute that said something about up to 25% of your time travel. It turns out Russia and Ukraine are pretty far away, and other important places like China are even farther. Thank you for the welcome, Jane. I just want to put it simply, the crowd in this room, both the quantity and the quality, and in particular the quality of the people right up here on the podium, are testament to this man, Jim Billington. So just a round of applause for all of you. This is really an incredible gathering, and I'm enormously privileged and intimidated to be sitting in the middle. So if I slide under the table in the midst of the proceedings, you'll know why. One of the priorities I had when I joined the Kennan Institute as its new director was to meet with Dr. Billington. That was an experience that I'll always remember. I learned a tremendous amount about the founding of the Institute, the personalities, unique characters, all who were involved, the war stories about its early days and the Wilson Center. But the main thing that I took away was his description of the urgent need and the complex challenge of creating such a center for advanced Russian studies in the nation's capital at the height of the Cold War. It meant a great deal to hear firsthand from one of the co-founders of the Kennan Institute that it was designed to foster the development of general understanding about then Soviet Russia, as well as the development of experts grounded in broad and deep knowledge about the region. The idea was to arrest and reverse a decline in America's capacity to understand that part of the world. Now that reminds me of some research I did recently while far away from Washington, D.C. I was doing a fellowship at NATO, and this gave me a chance to research George Kennan's original thinking and writing about the need for a capacity to understand Russia in the United States. George Kennan, of course, co-founded the Kennan Institute with Jim Billington and with Fred Starr, and he wrote in his 1946 long telegram that the United States government should see that our public is educated to the realities of the Russian situation, for he cautioned, there's nothing as dangerous or as terrifying as the unknown. And so he called for the study of Russia with courage, detachment, and objectivity. These, I believe, are the values upon which Dr. Billington, Ambassador Kennan, and Dr. Starr founded the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center, and I like to believe they're the values that we preserve and uphold to this day. But I also think many of us in this room are aware of the challenge of this moment, the precipitous decline in our government's support for this type of scholarship now, and the resulting paucity of experts on this region, particularly in policymaking circles. So I think it's especially timely for us to gather to celebrate a man who, as the panel's title suggests, has made a career of advancing not only knowledge, but knowledge in public service. I know that we at the Kennan Institute bear that legacy and that mission firmly in mind as our guiding star. I want to thank Jim for taking the time to meet with the newly minted Kennan director that day a couple of years ago, to show him what is possible eventually with one's career if one has the insight and the courage that Jim Billington has brought to bear. I want to thank the Billington family, his wife Marjorie, daughter Susan, and son Thomas. I want to thank Grace Kennan for joining us. And I want to thank, of course, this distinguished panel, which I'll have the privilege of moderating today. With the panelists' permission, I will simply proceed in the order in which I have the bios, offer a brief introduction. I think that these are people whose backgrounds speak for themselves. We'll begin with Ismail Sarageldin. He's the founding director of the Biblioteca Alexandrina, the new Library of Alexandria, inaugurated in 2002. He chairs the board of directors for the library's affiliated research institutes and museums. He advises the Egyptian Prime Minister on matters concerning culture, science, and museums, and he's held many important international positions, including Vice President of the World Bank. He's a chair and member of many advisory committees for academic research and scientific international institutions, has been involved in many important international organizations, has published over 100 books and monographs and over 500 papers on a variety of topics. What it is not mentioned in the bio is that the library was first established entirely of works written by Mr. He has hosted a cultural program on television in Egypt and developed a scientific television series in Arabic and English. His Bachelor of Science degree in engineering is from Cairo University, and his master's degree and PhD is from Harvard University. And he's received 34 honorary doctorates, which I understand also composes the wallpaper now of the library. So, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be with you today to honor an amazing individual, James Hadley Billington, and to do so in the presence of his lovely wife Marjorie and his children Susan and Thomas, as well as so many friends. Now, how do you take the measure of a man? By his accomplishments, but also by the love that he has generated among family, friends, and colleagues. Although I believe I qualify as a friend and that I could speak volumes about my love for Jim, I would nevertheless like to focus my remarks today on Jim Billington, the Librarian of Congress, and his legacy. More precisely, I will speak of one aspect of that legacy, which is the international aspect, and even more specifically of two projects that he initiated and with which I have been personally involved. But first, I want to note that he is undoubtedly a towering intellect, a great teacher, and a superb builder of institutions. From teaching history at Harvard and Princeton, he went on to head the Fulbright program, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Library of Congress. And as a scholar, he and I used to discuss many things, from the Kluge Center's mission to the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and the special music that we find in it. I was touched and impressed that he was able to recall from memory another Ismail Urbain, the revolutionary figure of old. And his books, including Fire in the Hearts of Men, The Icon and the Axe, and many others, as well as his Russian culture programs, were an inspiration. But I leave others to speak on these facets of his enormously productive career. Now let me cite a few things that he did and that had a great impact on me, starting from before I became the Librarian of Congress of Alexandria in 2001. I am a lifelong bibliophile, and I used to get nightmares at the idea of so many books published on acidic paper falling into dust all around the world. And it was Jim Billington who launched a mass deacidification program in 2001, which extended the lifespan of almost 4 million volumes and 12 million manuscript sheets. And he provided new collection storage facilities and opened that in 2002, and 4 million items are now available there. Now, during his tenure at the Library of Congress, Jim Billington doubled the size of the library's traditional analog collections and to more than 160 million items in 2014, but he also pioneered many of its digital programs and its international initiatives. Now, Jim Billington did not rely on increased government funding. Indeed, he did all he did while presiding over a 30% reduction in staff. But Jim was truly a fundraiser extraordinaire. Recall his creation of the Madison Council, the Culpeper Facility for Motion Pictures, as well as the American Music Legacy Program. But all that is but a small part of his enormous legacy. More than a skilled administrator, Jim Billington was a true visionary. He transformed the Library of Congress from the analog to the digital age, from the primary library in the USA to the primary library in the world, not just in terms of number of acquisitions, where maybe the British Library may still have a slight edge, but also in terms of its leadership in the content and quality of librarianship. He kept it at the forefront as the standard setter for the world, not only by sharing know-how with others, but also by designing new standards for the digital age. So he ensured that the Library of Congress, for example, produced the Resource Description and Access, the RDA, in 2010, a new cataloging standard for the digital age, which we are all adopting. And starting in 2011, the design of BibFrame has started, a data model for bibliographic description, which will become the new standard for the whole world in the next year or two. Jim Billington coped with the ICT revolution differently than most people. He saw through the need to go beyond merely putting material online and address the need to link the various parts in such a way that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Yes, he did. For he understood before anyone else that it was not just about the quantity of material that can be digitized and put out on the web for the search engines of the world led by Google to find snippets here and there of material. Rather, this was going to happen anyway. But what counted was how an institution like the Library of Congress presents these materials to the public. Jim was the first to recognize this with the American Memory Program. And he was the first to take this into an international partnership with the World Digital Library Program. Now, I know many may think that Jim Billington would be a technophobe, given his age and his love of books, but he had a profound understanding of the real impacts of the ICT revolution that so many of the technophiles who were simply enamored with the gadgets and the gee-whiz effects that ever more powerful computer and ever faster communications would bring. He understood that it opened up avenues for new kinds of communication about our cultural heritage and our common humanity. Jim Billington understood that letting a person into a room full of disorganized books, files, pictures, bric-a-brac, would be useless in promoting understanding. True, that person may suddenly fall upon an interesting picture or get enamored by the title of a book, but serving up information in that fashion to the public is not the vocation of a librarian or the aspiration of an intellectual. Selectivity, curation, and presentation were needed. And as early as 1990, Jim was the first to understand that the simple digitization of lots of material and putting it on the internet would simply be the equivalent of bringing that room full of disorganized books, files, pictures, and bric-a-brac to the person's hands delivered through their computers. But bringing the collection, curated, interlinked to each person on the internet, that would be something different. Digital curation is all about the selection, preservation, maintenance, collection, and archiving of these digital assets. It establishes, maintains, and adds value to the repositories of digital data for present and future use. This is a work that is accomplished by archivists, librarians, scientists, historians, and scholars. But if the design of the links and the explanations provided by the curators was also targeted to an audience that covers the K-12 range of the next generation, then what was simply a collection of data became an enormously valuable learning tool. Thus, one of the signature programs of the Library of Congress was born, the American Memory Program, which, according to Jim, had to be understood by a 10-year-old. The American Memory Program, launched in 1990, was not only a pioneering program, it was enormous. Today, it has put online and in a curated fashion more than 20 million American historical items from the collections of the library and other research institutions. And Jim also championed the library's many other internet services. Beyond the American Memory Program, there is the Congressional Database, Thomas, the online card catalog, the exhibitions information, the US Copyright Office, a website for children and families called America's Library, and all of that is really used. In 2013, I noticed the library had recorded 84 million visits and 519 million page views. In fact, I got to know Jim through the American Memory Program when I was vice president of the World Bank, and I was fascinated to learn more about that program. And from that contact, I was fascinated by the man, the intellectual and the historian, and the wisdom that he possessed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are today more than ever overwhelmed by the amount of data we generate. But data, when organized, becomes information, and information, when explained, becomes knowledge. But humanity needs more than knowledge. We need wisdom. Now, wisdom is a different quality. It is not an attribute of youth. The young can be intelligent, brilliant, even geniuses, but we would not attribute wisdom to them. We may say, that young man is wise beyond his years. Why? Because wisdom is a quality that comes from experience and reflection, merging of the intellect with the lessons of a life well lived, where knowledge has acquired the patina of age. And Jim Billington brought wisdom to the tasks that he chose to pursue. Now, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to turn to two programs that I had the privilege of working closely with Jim on their initiation and their continuation to this day: the World Digital Library and the International Summit of the Book. The World Digital Library is an ambitious and visionary program launched by Jim, supported by UNESCO. It brought together 181 libraries from 81 countries. WDL focused on quality, not quantity, and brought together curated material from all over the world, covering maps, manuscripts, pictures, and books in some 112 languages, presented the curated material in 7 languages. And Jim ensured that the Library of Congress provided the secretariat for the task, and a superb team from the LOC under the able leadership of John Van Oudenaren, who's here today, has indeed set a very high standard for the curation and presentation of these selected materials in a manner worthy of presenting the cultures of the world in all their richness and diversity. Now, the WDL is quite a small library, but the entire Library of Congress started with a mere 6,500 books from the Jefferson collection. WDL today stands at 14,000 items and 600,000 images. Nothing by comparison to what the internet provides. But it still succeeds in attracting 4 million visitors a year and is referenced by an amazing 3.3 million links from the internet into the WDL. Thus is quality recorded and recognized. Now, visionaries are those who see the need for things that others ignore. Jim Billington did that in launching the International Summit of the Book. Jim believed that the world should annually celebrate the book, the instrument of cultural development and cultural continuity throughout all the cultures of the world. He initiated the summit, he called in UNESCO to support it, and he and Congressman John Lawson deserve immense credit for that. It was launched at the Library of Congress in December 2012, and I had the privilege of delivering the opening keynote address. I have re-recorded that address at the Library of Alexandria, and I'm happy to give you a copy of this DVD as a keepsake with a text copy inside as well. I'm happy to give it to you as a souvenir of your decision to invite me to speak at that memorable event. Now, since that time, we took the summit to Singapore, Paris, and Alexandria. I participated in each of these events, and next year it goes to Ireland as your initiative lives on. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, I have been privileged to work closely with Jim Billington and his marvelous colleagues at the Library of Congress on these two particular programs. The World Digital Library, launched in 2009, and the International Summit of the Book, launched in 2012. This last year, I presided at the annual meeting of both events in November 2015, just after Jim had retired on September 30th. It is telling that the participants in both events asked me to convey a special appreciation to Jim Billington on their behalf, and I have both of these documents here to deliver to Jim Billington. But I need to read to you what the text says. The members of the World Digital Library assembled in Alexandria, Egypt on November 6, 2015. Having learned of the retirement of James H. Billington, the Librarian of Congress and the initiator of the World Digital Library, wish to formally record our esteem for his visionary and exemplary leadership and our profound appreciation of his countless contributions that made the World Digital Library a reality. With our best wishes for a happy and serene retirement, knowing that your legacy lives on and grows from strength to strength. Now, at the same time, back to back, like we did in 2012, we also had the International Summit of the Book. And there, the text is somewhat different if the ambition is the same. It says, "We, the librarians, intellectuals, and book lovers, assembled in Alexandria, Egypt, on November 6, 2015, to celebrate the 4th International Summit of the Book, carrying the torch of the previous summits initiated at the Library of Congress in 2012, carried forward in Singapore in 2013 and Paris 2014, hereby record our esteem for and appreciation of the initiative and vision of James H. Billington, Librarian of Congress and initiator of the International Summit of the Book. With profound thanks from all of us and the untold millions of book lovers in the world, for the book was, is, and remains the primary form of cultural communication and transmission of knowledge across space and time." Ladies and gentlemen, we salute Jim Billington, not only the Librarian of Congress, but also as the Librarian for the world. Builder of great institutions, visionary leader of a legendary institution, a great library made greater by your tenure at its helm, a world enriched by the visions that you have advanced, the dreams that you believed in, the people that you nurtured, the culture that you cared for so much. Jim, we thank you for all you have done, but above all, we thank you for being the wonderful person that you are.
My speech, I have nothing to say.
We have to pick gymnastics now.
Thank you, Ismail. That was truly moving, and I would say worthy, perhaps, of a world library in its scope, and certainly of digitization for posterity. I'm particularly glad that we have the cameras here doing that. Next, it's my privilege to introduce Vartan Gregorian, as Jane said, the one and only. He's the 12th president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, a grant-making institution founded by Andrew Carnegie in 1911. He assumed that position in 1997, before which he served 9 years as president of Brown University, and before that, from 1981 to 1989, as president of the New York Public Library. He himself was born in Tabriz, Iran, to Armenian parents, and received his elementary education in Iran and his secondary education in Lebanon. In 1956, he entered Stanford University, where he majored in history and the humanities and graduated with honors. He was awarded a PhD in history from Stanford in 1964. He taught European and Middle Eastern history at San Francisco State College, University of California, LA, University of Texas at Austin, and in 1972 he joined the University of Pennsylvania, where he was appointed Tarzian Professor of History and Professor of South Asian History. He was a founding dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania and later became its 23rd provost. He's the author of a great many books, including The Road to Home, My Life and Times, Islam, a Mosaic, Not a Monolith, and The Emergence of Modern Afghanistan, 1880 to 1946. One might argue it is still emerging, which is being now reissued, which was reissued in 2013 with a new introduction. He's received a great many fellowships and awards, in addition to, and I can see that we have a competition brewing, 70 honorary degrees. But here's the great thing. When you're at this level, you just call all your friends and you give each other degrees. In 1998, President Clinton, that's not how it works. Okay. President Clinton awarded him the National Humanities Medal, and in 2004, President Bush awarded him the Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civil award. In 2009, President Obama appointed him to the White House Fellowships Commission. He currently serves on a great many boards, including the Institute for Advanced Study and the National September 11th Memorial Museum. Bartan, the floor is
Thank you very much. Mr. Seragildin gave my speech, so I'm now, while he was talking, I'm putting some notes to be able to be coherent or say something meaningful. Because Ismail is very cultured, very erudite, very comprehensive, and very precise. So I'm going to try to see what I can do to deserve to follow as a footnote to Ismail Seragildin. Let me just mention one thing. Nation has several great libraries. Library of Congress is the best in our nation and in the world. It's the world's largest library, but also expanding library. Libraries are not depositories, just putting things in the hall and then taken care of. I remember Indira Gandhi had invited me years ago to go to India, visit Indian libraries, and I did. And I told this to Jim when I went to Calcutta, met a librarian and said, what are we doing? We're following Library of Congress example, 2 volumes of each book published in India go into reserve. What do? We send to the basement. What happens afterwards? Not my obligation. My duty. So having book, having collection carries historical obligation and duties, how to preserve it. Because librarians are custodians of not only the book, but our heritage, the memory of mankind, of all its accomplishments, all its failures, all its aspirations. Hence, we need libraries in order not to have self-inflicted Alzheimer's disease as a nation, because libraries are there to remind us always. Second, as president of New York Public Library, I have to tell you that's where I came to know James really and appreciate him for several reasons. Because in 1968, when I joined faculty of University of Texas at Austin, I was part of a committee who wanted to lure, that's a wonderful academic term, to lure or to send feelers to see whether Jim will be willing to join University of Texas faculty. Well, it did not happen, unfortunately, for Texas, fortunately for Jim. And then I came to University of Pennsylvania. There's another move to lure Jim Billington to University of Pennsylvania. That also did not happen. But what happened was Woodrow Wilson Institute, thank God, and also what happened in Library of Congress. Now I have to confess that after I became president of New York Public Library, I realized 2 things about my position. Many librarians dislike the fact that nation's top positions go to non-librarians. That's a fact, and rightly so. Well, we spend all our lives in the library profession, and Harvard Library, Beinecke Library, the York Public Library, they all go to now librarians, and most of it to historians. And I proposed New York Public Library librarians that in order to repair the damage, I'll be happy to get a Master of Library Sciences. And they uniformly denounced my move. But I'm saying this because it's natural, the tension, and I also understand why historians are chosen for this position. Because one is to have a cultural perspective. One is to go beyond specialization in order to see totality of culture. And one is also, you're not hiring a specialist, you're hiring also an intellectual. Because library, by its very demand, requires all these qualifications. That's why you have Ismail Serageldin, head of Library of Alexandria, on whose board I serve, by the way, and he gives equally beautiful speeches at the board meetings, so you should know that, Jim. And, but at the same time, Jim is all those three: historian, lover of the book, bibliophile, intellectual, curious about all cultures. Not only all cultures, but I have to tell you also, I was very impressed, he must have forgotten, that he told me one of the most unexploited, unexplored, unused collections at the Library of Congress are German publications, 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, from Nebraska, from Iowa, wherever German immigrants came. And I was, as a matter of fact, I started my movement. Let's start a foundation to utilize, exploit all the German publications library. He said it with such passion that I thought he was asking me to raise money in order to study German collections of the Library of Congress. And the other thing, Jim helped me when I was president of the New York Public Library to go acid-free. One of my first acts, thanks to Barbara Goldsmith and all the writers, we brought 100 writers to vouch that they will not allow any of their publications to be published on acid paper. And that did a tremendous thing, and I owe thanks to Jim because I consulted him at the time. Jim also appreciates historical anniversaries, not just the bicentennial of this great institution, the Library of Congress, but the fact also, the Morrill Act. Morrill Act established in the middle of Civil War, established public universities in the United States. That's one of the forgotten acts of Lincoln, President Lincoln. In the middle of Civil War, President Lincoln approved Senator Morrill's Act, which created public universities. They also established even a commission in the middle of Civil War to study the merits of metric measures. Can you imagine if anybody does that? Editorials would denounce them wasting taxpayers' money studying this in the middle of a war we are facing. But they were interested in nation's future, and that's what they were doing. They were building a future. So Jim helped us. Together, we had the exhibition on Morrill Act, and we published entire Lincoln's speeches in Library of America, and we sent to every congressman, every governor, lieutenant governor, president, vice president of the United States, first Republican president's speeches. Only 3 of them returned because it was more than $50. And I'd send them to their their alma mater. I said, refused by, but kindly sent to alma mater. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention about Jim. Jim is one of most eloquent gives articulations of the book. It was mentioned here, if you have not read it, The Meaning of the Library, A Cultural History by Alice Crawford, who edited it. In that there's a chapter by Jim, and I'd like to read one paragraph only. So books are our guardians of memory, tutors in language, pathways to reason, our golden gate to the royal road of imagination, their oasis of coherence where things are put together rather than just taken apart. It's beautiful. I also believe that books are our only companions for life. Now, some people may choose it into any form they want, but I'll show you, which I did once before. Somebody told me the entire Greek literature is in this cell phone. I congratulate him. Have you read it? No. So it doesn't matter. You're in storage business. You're taking from this storage to mini storage to another storage. That's what not progress is. Progress is to be able to get it, not confuse means with the end. I was reminded also Mark Twain, when Maine was connected to San Francisco, either Mark Twain or Thoreau said, Maine has been connected to San Francisco, and Maine has nothing to say to San Francisco. So technology is great, but communication is to build communities. And that's what Library of Congress does. It has assumed on its own, not because Library of Congress demanded it, but because Librarians of Congress, as librarians, knew that they're responsible for the welfare of all the other libraries in our nation. So opening collections to all the small libraries and others was a great tribute to Jim and all the other librarians who tried to do that. And I don't want to take more time, but I'll tell you several other things about Jim. Jim also is in charge of a behemoth Leviathan, administration of any organization that is with federal government. It's remarkable. I could not work for bureaucracy, but bureaucracies are necessary to make our democracy function. What we need is not to be anti-bureaucratic, to be anti-incompetent bureaucrats. Because to me, the three original sins are ignorance, incompetence, and indifference. And that's one of the things all our institutions have to confront that. Librarians, heads of libraries, heads of all institutions. Otherwise, our cultural institutions will go atrophy, and the system becomes more important than the medium becomes more important than the message it conveys. So today, we face, and Ismail is here, and that's why I'm saying this, every American, everybody in the world, for the first time in creation since history, has their own Library of Alexandria. You don't have to be Pharaoh anymore. You are already Pharaoh. What you do with it, what you don't do with it, is the crime of the century. If you don't do justice to the fact that you have your own library, which pharaohs fought to build, preserve, now you have it at your fingertips to receive, to read, to think. Don't blame them for lack of teachers, lack of books, lack of institutions, but lack of instinctive search for knowledge and wisdom. As Ismail said, T.S. Eliot summed up very well. So where is information, where is knowledge in information, and where is wisdom in knowledge? That's what we need, distillation of everything into wisdom and knowledge. Library of Congress is also international in nature. And that's what Ismail Beragaldin has worked with. That's why I also have great pride to have dealt with Jim in supporting the World Digital Library, in supporting preservation, and also sometimes serving as go-between in getting a collection or two for Library of Congress. And therefore making curators sometimes angry and making donors angry. But I think the destination of every major collection in this country has to be in an institution such as Library of Congress, because it guards our national heritage. So it should not come to you as a surprise when we say largest library in the world. Library of Congress is also magnificent for one other thing. 2/3 of its books, its content, is international. And it's natural because 2/3 of, there are 16 languages were collected by Thomas Jefferson in his small library. So from our founder of Thomas Jefferson on, Library of Congress has shown how it's not parochial, how it's not nationalist, because the world is its main garden in order to cultivate. And last point I want to mention, Jim also has to satisfy Congress, naturally, and maybe I'm breaking confidence if I am. Jim did not tell me, I discovered it. There are rooms congressmen can meet, contemplate, read, be private. That's wonderful service to Congress. And the others is opening Congress, Library of Congress, to all the children and school children and others. Jim also is not parochial, because I had discussion with somebody who said he was parochial. He's not parochial. He also thought Library of Congress has to also play the role of diplomatic affinity, building neighborhoods diplomatically. In Russia, he did it. And more than that, you don't know maybe, but he also went to Iran when we were trying track 2, how to build relations with Iran. He went to visit National Library of Iran. Of course, federal government would not pay the flight of Librarian of Congress on behalf of the United States to go to Iran. I'm glad that Mr. Carnegie from Heavens said, we'll take care of Librarian of Congress's trip because Andrew Carnegie was dedicated to international peace. Jim, therefore, I meant to mention, has multiple tasks and he's done all of them well. There are critics, actually. Any major organization will have its critics. But one thing we should not forget, the mission of Library of Congress has been kept afloat to serve the nation and the world, to build bridges of understanding, to treat all cultures as important, not as minor, major, and then also to save those cultures. One of the last acts of Jim Billington was to help repatriate Afghan memory to Afghanistan. Well, now if you say that, what does it mean? The country has been destroyed, and their Library of Congress has their heritage. So Jim and John is here, sent 8 hard drives to 8 Afghan universities, so to have their culture intact. A previous, in 1960s, 70s, previous Librarian of Congress also did something wonderful, because no one who writes history of Pakistan, India, can do it without coming to Library of Congress. You know why? Because PL 480, when America was selling grain to India and Pakistan, we could only be paid in low prices and in rupees. And rupees could not be spent outside of those countries. So a genius, for the first time in one of bureaucracies, said, my God, we should buy all their periodicals. We should subscribe to all their periodicals. So all the periodicals of India and Pakistan now are guests of Library of Congress, ready to be serving their nations. So Jim is a scholar, historian, intellectual, internationalist, but at the same time curious in terms of culture and lover of the book. What a symbol is to be a lover of the book and try to see how you can disseminate through latest technologies. Sure, some of it has been slow, the critics say, but see how much has been accomplished. And it will be accomplished more, because Jim has laid great foundations of this great institution. So thank you for all your help to New York Public Library, Jim. Thank you for your help for Nebraska Germans who have not published their publications. Thank you for your help for Afghanistan. Thank you for your help Russia. Thank you for educating Congress about Russia. Thanks for being a good teacher, good friend, but always modest and always eloquent. Thank you very much.
So maybe the only distinction that can top dozens of honorary doctorates is what it sounds like, Vartan, you've just nominated Jim for, and that's sainthood. I think technically St. Patrick's sainthood is based on having saved knowledge for Western civilization. So you've just
No, don't say that, because some saints have become saints by destroying things.
Okay.
Jim is a builder, not destroyer.
all right. A creative and productive sainthood, then only. From Jim Billington to the other Jim in my life, Jim Collins, senior associate and diplomat in residence at the Russia and Eurasia program in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the other Carnegie upon which Andrew looks down from the heavens. He served as U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation from 1997 to 2001. Before that appointment, he was ambassador at large and special advisor to the Secretary of State for the newly independent states. And he served as deputy chief of mission and chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow from 1990 to 93. For those of you paying attention, that's between Ambassador Matlock and Ambassador Strauss. Ambassador Matlock is here with us. We're very happy. And a few important things happened that summer of 1991 when Jim was in the position of chargé. In addition to his 3 diplomatic postings in Moscow, he held positions at the U.S. Embassy in Amman, Jordan, as Consulate General in Izmir, Turkey, and at the Department of State and the White House in Washington. He's been active on the boards of nonprofit organizations concerned with U.S. foreign policy and relations with Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia, and he's been with the Carnegie Endowment since 2007. He also chairs the U.S. side of the Dartmouth Dialogue, which is a 55-year-old U.S.-Soviet and now U.S.-Russian second-track citizens diplomacy effort. And he has been a tremendous voice of reason on Russia and U.S. foreign policy generally, particularly in our now troubled times. And I would add that he has taught me everything that I know about Russia, except that I have a feeling he's about to turn around and say that Jim Billington has taught him everything he knows. So I'll leave it at that. Jim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I think it's now 58 years ago that I went into Harvard Hall at Harvard University for the first course I ever took in Russian history. And it was a rather young assistant professor who taught that course by the name of Jim Billington. And I have to say, I think for both of us, all of that kind of got out of hand over time. Both of our careers, in one way or another, ended up being associated with what has happened to the part of the world that we can call Eurasia or Russia or Soviet Union Warsaw Pact, whatever you want to call it. It was this part of the world that was, in a sense, the defining part of the world in many ways for the way Americans, for the last half of the 20th century, sort of approached our world responsibilities and the way we looked at the world. And so my introduction at that time from Jim Billington was about as good as you could get. And it served me well through a career. But I want to talk a little bit about Jim as librarian and policy developer, maker, implementer, and guide. A lot's been said about the library here, but I would simply make a couple of points as someone who had a diplomatic career about the library. I think everywhere I went, somebody had a ministry of culture. Americans don't have a ministry of culture. But in a peculiar way, the library embodies the idea of a ministry of culture without being that. In my view, the library is, in a sense, the repository for the expression of the American people about what they've been, what they are, what they want to be, and how they see their place in the world. And it's, I think, particularly important as well that, unlike other countries, the library doesn't belong to the executive branch or the president. It belongs to the Congress, to what all of our founders meant to be really the people's place. And in a sense, I would simply say that in that regard, the library and the librarian are an expression of America at what it tries to be, at what it has been, and what it hopes the world will see us as representing. Now that's a big job, and I don't think anyone has done it better than Jim Billington. I suppose since both of us started a long time ago on this sort of preoccupation with Russian language and Russia and its history and culture and so forth, it was fortuitous that Jim, in some sense, came to the job of being the head of the Library of Congress and having this role at a time when suddenly all that we thought about the Soviet Union, that part of the world, about its ideology, about how it was the other, was suddenly in upheaval. And there were no certainties anymore. So, Jim, you came to the library, as I understand it, at sort of the height of perestroika, when Mr. Gorbachev was beginning to question the whole basis for the Soviet system. And uncertainties were far greater than certainties. Now, in that kind of a context, I am here to tell you that I don't look to political scientists and I don't look to economists for what you think about and where's the wisdom about what's going to happen. You look to historians. And I think in that sense, our country was extremely fortunate that Jim, as Librarian of Congress, was a historian, probably our best recognized historian of Russia and its region, and that he was in a position to have a degree of influence with a lot of people who mattered in the way this country approached and responded to the changes that were coming and were taking place in the Russian Federation. Now, I think there was a theme to the way Jim approached his, development of how the Americans, from his point of view, should begin to deal with this strange thing that was opening up. And it was based in much of Jim's historic study in the work of two mentors he worked with, Isaiah Berlin and Dmitry Likhachev. It was fundamentally an abiding belief that if you gave the Russian people and the people of the former Soviet Union access to what was diverse and what was rich and what was very different from what they had experienced over the 3/4 of a century that the communists had put them in a straitjacket, that we could have faith over time that they would come to a reasonable and sensible and culturally relevant approach to deciding their future, and one that would make them partners with whom we could certainly coexist and live at peace. He never thought it was going to be easy, but I think that was the guiding idea. And so I wanted simply to mention 4 things that he did, in my view, not by any means definitively the list, but 4 things that he did in his time when I worked with him on this sort of unique challenge of what do you do with a country that has isolated itself for 3/4 of a century and suddenly throws the door open, and how we should best define an approach to making the relations with that people work. I think the first thing I would single out is that Jim did have his bosses in the Congress, but in many ways I think his bosses understood that they had a guide. Jane mentioned that he gave her an education on a CODEL. A CODEL is a congressional delegation, if you don't know what that is, that was traveling to Russia. Well, he led, I don't know how many, certainly a dozen or more, over a period of several years. And fundamentally, what was important about that from a standpoint of a diplomat who was on the other end was that those congressional delegations and the people who had worked with Jim came to the Soviet Union first and then the Russian Federation reasonably well prepared to have an open mind, to have some background and some sense for what it was they were encountering, And most importantly, I think, where he could do it, he imparted the idea to them that you need to listen. It's not just articulating or sending out a set of points. It's also listening to what the other side has to say. And he helped those Codels and the members of it understand also what they were hearing. So, Jim, I mean, I think the role you played in helping to give the members of Congress a sense for what they were dealing with in this rapidly changing world of upheaval, and particularly in the Russian case, was immensely important. The second thing Jim did was, in a sense, to make a major contribution, and this in his almost in his library hat, but in the broadest expanse of the term, to taking institutions, the libraries of the Russian Federation, which had been straitjacketed for 3/4 of a century in the most sort of arcane of access controls and so forth, where information was essentially parceled out by rank. But libraries were not designed for people to go in and read or to explore. They were designed to provide the people who needed to know something with that information. And it was a little suspicious if you went and explored, I think. Jim brought to friends in Russia, and one in particular, Katya Genyeva, I think, became a partner in finding ways to open up Russia's libraries. He pushed people like the American military to send books from libraries that were closing in Europe. He helped Russian libraries understand sort of modern library techniques. He opened up entirely new connections for these kinds of libraries to a world they had never had any encounter with. And he also developed relationships with libraries in the largest sense of the word, things like the film libraries, the emerging pools of documents and so forth. And he helped helped Russia preserve its past, to organize and understand its past, and to develop, in a sense, what I would say is the modern approach to libraries for the Russian Federation. This was the place they looked, and they looked to Jim Billington. Thirdly, when I was ambassador, it was very clear that one of the problems we had as the American government was that we had built a diplomatic representation in Russia that was designed to fight the Cold War, which more or less meant you lived in a vault, and there was some suspicion about having anything to do with someone on the outside. And so I thought we had to find a new way to engage the Russian people at a broader base. And so I cooked up an idea with Jim's support and encouragement of something we called an American Corner. And again, it was libraries and Jim's opening to the libraries and through people he knew that made this possible. Because what we did was say, we will give you a computer link, a computer and a printer, and a collection, which Jim Billington was responsible for collecting, of books. If you will give us a room and make it open to anyone without a pass and without any qualifications. Well, by the time I left, we had some 20 of those, and I think by the time the program was finally shut down by Mr. Putin, there were something over 40. But the reality was it was the first real opportunity for most Russians out in the provinces of that huge country to come into contact with some kind of official American presence, or to come to use the instruments and the collections of something like the Library of Congress because they had the computer. And we used to have lines waiting to get at those computers. So while it was a thing of its time, it was an important opening. But what it represented also was the kind of idea that Jim kept pushing, that you need to give Russians and give citizens of the former Soviet space the opportunity to see alternatives, that it wasn't all simply the way they were told it had to be for most of their adult lives. And the final program he developed, and this really is Jim's alone, and it got cooked up initially at my dining room table during the coup in August 1991, but it took a little while to get it going. But in 1999, Jim Billington managed to convince the Congress, and in particular Senator Stevens, that it would be a good idea to have a lot of Russians come to the United States, even if for a short time, to see how we do things, to understand how Americans live their daily lives, what they do day to day, how we deal with our issues. And so that gave birth to what has become the Open World Program. That program has now brought about 24,000 individuals from the former Soviet Union and East Europe. They come from every province of almost every country in the former Soviet Union. And the idea has remained the same since the inception of the program, and it is consummately the one that I think embodied the ideas that Jim had for this program. That you bring people who have not been here before, doesn't matter whether they speak English or not, you give them a couple of days in Washington to understand what our bureaucracy thinks they should, and then you send them out to some town or city in the United States and let them live with families or among families to see how we really do things at the local level, how we do the things they have to do. Now, that program has been extremely successful, and I can tell you it is unique, and today is the biggest program that the United States government has in that part of the world for exchangees. So I simply would say that in the broadest sense of the word, when it came to America's policy abroad or the development of our relations with a rapidly changing and totally transforming part of the world, Jim's ideas and the use of the library as an instrument to develop and conduct and conceptualize different approaches to bring people together and to bring our people and the Russian people and Ukrainian people and so forth to understand a bit more about each other. There was no equal to that in the U.S. government. And I say that with a great deal of pride at having worked with Jim over these years. So, Jim, you have a legacy that goes well beyond the book. It is sustained by the book, but it is also sustained by a growing generation of people across a wide range of the world who had their first encounters with the United States because of what you've done. So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Last and certainly not least, I have the privilege of introducing my predecessor at the Kennan Institute and my boss, Blair Rubel, who's Vice President for Programs at the Wilson Center. He's Director of the Center's Urban Policy Laboratory and served for nearly a quarter century as Director of the Kennan Institute, while also coordinating programming on comparative urban studies for 2 decades. He received his master's and his PhD in political science from the University of Toronto, and his bachelor's in with highest honors in political science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's edited more than a dozen volumes and is the author of 6 monographs studying urban issues, Russia, and other related topics, including most recently Washington's U Street a biography. And in that connection, I just have to relate that very recently, when I had the opportunity, on Blair's guidance, advice, and with his introduction, to take a rather high-level Russian delegation for a tour of the other Washington, of U Street, Washington as a city and not a symbol. Of course, we took them to Bohemian Caverns and the African American Civil War Museum, which blew their minds, by the way, the Howard Theater, of course, Ben's Chili Bowl. I realized that this distinguished group of Russians who really thought that they understood Washington, from that moment understood you always have something new to learn. And in that spirit, I give Blair the floor to talk about Jim Billington.
Thank you, Matt, and it's a pleasure to be up here sharing the podium with the director of the Kennan Institute.
Yeah.
It's very nice.
Plural.
I've been asked to speak about Jim's scholarship, and to do so in about 10 minutes. And if you've ever tried to pick up any of the books that Jim has written, you'll understand how difficult that is, although it's actually very good for your health, because his books, particularly two books, The Icon and the Axe and Fire in the Minds of Men, are monumental books in every way, including in their heft. So I decided that what I wanted to try to do was just offer a few observations about how this work in intellectual history has in fact shaped the intellectual discourse of our times. Now, part of that has to do with scholarship and the books themselves, and part of it has to do, as you've just heard, with how Jim has translated thought into action through the building of institutions which actually carry that thought further into the future. And as Jane Harman said in her opening remarks, we're in an institution that it's actually impossible to understand what this institution would be if we don't take into account Jim Billington's remarkable role, which really began with Jim's remarkable scholarship and the way he thinks about the world. Now, I want to go back to a comment that Vartan made, but I want to suggest that Vartan is never just a footnote in any gathering. And I think we had evidence of that. But he spoke very eloquently about the power of the book. And what he's really talking about is the power of thought. And it's the power of thought that intellectual historians like Jim really explore. And it's that question of what makes people's minds work that underscored the importance of his interpretive history of Russia, The Icon and the Axe. This is a book which has defined how we think about Russia and is widely regarded as one of the landmarks in Russian history. Not just American writing on Russia, but writing by anyone on Russia. Now, I never have told this story, but Jim came to speak at the University of North Carolina when I was an undergraduate, a couple of years after The Icon of the Axe had appeared, and we had to read. It was the hot new book in the field, and we started out by reading that book, which I'm not sure as a sophomore in a university I, at the time, fully grasped. But Jim came and lectured, and that was the night that I decided I really wanted to understand Russia. So when we talk a lot about how people influence other people, but it's often through private moments like that the world is changed one decision at a time. And Jim's scholarship, I think, really begins to capture the importance of that one thought at a time transforming the world. it is an approach that begins, of course, with history. And Jim, like George Kennan, understood that we can't speak about contemporary Russian affairs with any wisdom or intelligence unless we carry within us extensive knowledge of the Russian past. Not that we know facts, not that we know how to look something up with a search engine, but there's knowledge within us about Russia that allows us to begin to try to think about the Russian presence. And this perspective, as Matt Rajansky has reminded us, is what led Jim and George Kennan and Fred Starr to establish the Kennan Institute within the Wilson Center shortly after Jim's arrival here in Washington. It's another example of how thought translated through institutions takes on a life that carries beyond all of us. Jim also became a model for many of us in the room, I'm sure, by continuing his scholarship even as he assumed larger and larger administrative responsibilities. Actually, this is a panel full of people who can remind us of the important link between scholarship and administrative posts. Because these are tasks that are in more ways than one tied together. Because in thinking about what an institution should be, what a strategy is for an institution, it really comes down to how we think about the world and how we can translate our thoughts about the world into action. So Jim was not only a scholar writing these big, hefty, profound books, but he was a human being who was translating the knowledge in those books through his visionary perspective into institutions and concrete action. And as you begin to look at the core of his scholarship, you begin to see that Jim is writing about a world and inhabits a world in which culture and religious, or perhaps more concisely, moral thought profoundly shapes how human beings live their lives. And moral thought shapes how societies and history develop. His monumental Fire in the Minds of Men makes it very clear that ideas shape the world. For Jim, the concept of liberty is essential fuel for driving human action. It may be actually one of the reasons why he has approached libraries as a democratic institution the way he has. But he tells the story in the book of how important the French Revolution was in igniting these fires in the minds of men. Because Jim sees the French Revolution as having shaped the world profoundly through a revolutionary slogan, which of course was much more than a slogan, liberté, égalité, and fraternité. And as those ideas shaped, they shaped the world, not the least, they reshaped Russia. So to comprehend contemporary Russia means you can't just take a single dimension, and Vartan actually noted the importance of not relying on a single entry point. But we have to begin to understand how various factors are interwoven through the lenses of historical, cultural, and ideological understandings of what Russia can be and what Russia is and what Russia strives to be. And at the center of this quest for what it means to be Russian, as Jim argues in his later works, such as The Face of Russia and Russia in Search of Itself, stands Russian Orthodox thought and belief. That set of beliefs provides the moral underpinning to Russian thought and action, an underpinning that is different from Anglo-Saxon sensibilities about the meaning of the moral life. Indeed, as Scottish traveler and foreign correspondent Donald Mackenzie Wallace wrote in the late 19th century, Russia often offends the Protestant mind. Yet this doesn't mean just that Russia doesn't have a moral base, a moral compass. It means rather that Russian moral calibration depends on different readings altogether. And that's an idea that runs through Jim's writings about Russia. And I think it also explains his remarkable friendship with Dmitry Likhachov, who was a profoundly moral figure, particularly as Russia searched for itself following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Jim understood the power of Likhachov. Now, this perspective on Russia he brought with him when he came to Princeton and Washington, first the Wilson Center and the Library of Congress. And it's interesting, I think, to trace it back a little bit. It's a perspective he shares with some of the greatest thinkers on Russia during the 20th century, including his own professor at Oxford, Isaiah Berlin. These are thinkers who devoted their lives to trying to understand Russia through the prism of that society's historical and philosophical foundations. And not surprisingly, Billington studied with Berlin just as Berlin was developing what became his famous two concepts of liberty, in which he argued that a single political concept such as liberty can have a plurality of meanings, often contradicting one another. And I hadn't realized, I looked at the date of when Berlin's seminal work came out, and it must have been about the time you probably were discussing it in seminars. And it's a really powerful, important idea about the meaning of liberty, but it also is a powerful, important idea about the importance of contradictions in consciousness. And this is especially true when we approach Russia, where George Kennan once quipped, when confronted with two contradictory statements about Russia, assume they're both true. Now, as Jim Collins noted, in times of uncertainty, we have to turn to historians to help us appreciate why it is that two contradictory phenomena can be part of a whole. And this is the role where historians, and especially intellectual and cultural historians like Jim Billington, come in. Now, why does this matter at all? If we stop to consider present-day debates about Putin and today's Russia, I think we can begin to understand how much Jim's perspective can inform a Western world struggling to understand Putin, his goals, and his relationship with the Russian people. He and his work should force us to step back and think a moment. Now, what's interesting is Washington, within 3 miles of where we're sitting, there are scores of people who are ambitious and want to have the opportunity to do what George Kennan did, which was to sit down in an afternoon and write out a long diplomatic cable which shapes the parameters of U.S. foreign policy for half a century. What they fail to appreciate is that a Kennan, a Berlin, a Billington didn't just sit down and write a profoundly intellectual cable or article or book. They were able to write the way they have written because they had already devoted a portion of their souls to engaging with Russia. This engagement is the wellspring of their insight, their knowledge, and their wisdom. Jim captures this as well as anyone in the opening of his book about his experiences being in Moscow in August 1991, Russia Transformed, Breakthrough to Hope. This appeared while events were unfolding, shortly after, in the months after the failed coup. It was a time of heady euphoria about Russia's future in Washington, if not in Moscow. And what's important to understand is Jim was clearly enjoying very nice dinners at Jim Collins' dinner table, but he was also getting out in the city, and that becomes very much reflected. He left the bunker and went out into Russia that was living through, Moscow that was living through a revolutionary moment. And this is why, with all his knowledge coming together with that moment, he was able to begin his book. The Cold War ended with neither a bang nor a whimper, but with an unanticipated, spontaneous heroism of a relatively small band of Russians at the heart of the empire in Moscow. These events provided an adrenaline shot of hope and self-confidence to the Russian people. But soaring summer hopes predictably gave way to a winter of discontent, for the events started in motion a process of innovation and change in Russian society that was bound to continue in conditions fraught with peril. Democracy was an endangered species even at birth. He then continues, and again, remember, he's writing this in 1991 or 1992. The post-communist Russian commitment to democracy and a market economy was not accompanied by any real historical experience in Russia or exposure to functioning foreign institutions. Their preparation for a new path was inadequate, and many zigzags clearly still lie ahead. He then adds, to understand the immensity of the change that the August days brought to Russia, one must recall the heavy legacy of Russian history with its almost unrelieved record of autocratic rule and popular submissiveness. Now, what's important is Jim isn't saying there's no hope, because he writes about the events of August 1991 as a breakthrough moment for the Russian people. But that hope is tempered by his appreciation of everything that led up to those events, and therefore his understanding of the enormity of the transformation that lie ahead. And I think the legacy of Jim's scholarship on Russia, for anyone concerned about Russian society and Russian culture and the Russian people, is to demonstrate through his own writings that such an appreciation is possible. Thank you.
Well, Blair, thank you so much, and I cannot thank this panel enough for providing the heft, the depth, the soaring rhetoric, and of course Jim's insight in his very own words from such a wide range of the parts of human life that, Jim, your work has touched. We're at time, but I know that a lot of you gathered in this room, as I said earlier, testament to the incredible esteem in which Jim is held in this town and in our country and globally, might have thoughts that you want to add. I know a few people have mentioned that to me already. So what I would suggest is that in a relatively concise way, we make the microphone, if we have microphones, yes, we do, available to anyone who will raise their hand now and let me know. We'll take a few minutes now to let you add your comments and thoughts to those of the panel. Yes, Wayne.
Hello, I'm Wayne Mary of the American Foreign Policy Council. I'd like to add just a word about Dr. Billington's attributes as a great teacher, because he was a great pedagogue and scholar and conductor of seminars, even had he never come to Washington and done all the great things he did here. I was fortunate enough to be one of his graduate students at another institution named for Woodrow Wilson up the road in Princeton. And what I took away from that seminar was the astonishing concept that the Soviet Union was not going to be around forever. And I remember vividly the discussion of his assertion that the Great Schism in the Russian Church was a more fundamental watershed for Russia than was the Bolshevik Revolution. All of us students regarded that with some incredulity. But by the end of the course and by the end of my first go-through of the Icon and the Acts, I'd been persuaded of that. So when I entered the Foreign Service and went into the State Department, where I encountered this uniform view that the Soviet Union was the culmination of Russian history, hence forever, hence the Cold War was permanent, I at least had this subversive notion that it wouldn't be the case. And in my own assignments in Moscow, I came to a deepening understanding of that. I certainly didn't expect to be around when it had its culmination in the end of the Soviet Union, but when it did, and I was there, I certainly cannot claim to have been psychologically prepared, but intellectually, I was entirely comfortable. And that was entirely because of that seminar I'd had earlier with a great teacher.
Thank you, Wayne. Okay, right here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Svetlana Ryhova-Tibets. In 1996, I participated at the program Freedom Support in Contemporary Issues. And a friend of mine, Sarah McClendon, she brought me to your office in the library. And I asked him, what language will she speak? He said, it doesn't matter, English, Russian. And I appreciate you personally right now and everybody who is in this room, because this program gave me a lot of possibilities. And for two countries, for both Russia and America. Thank you very much. You are my best teacher. Thank you.
Yes, right here.
I just wanted to mention one honor which was not mentioned by our esteemed panel.
Just introduce yourself, please.
Mark Newman. I'm a friend of the Wilson Center and the Billingtons.
I can't see anyone. Klieg lights.
And that is the honor Public Law 114-113, an act of Congress signed by the President of the United States, President Obama, which designates Dr. Billington as Librarian of Congress Emeritus. Only the second person, the third person in the history of our country to be afforded that honor. And so for all of you who don't think that Speaker Ryan, Leaders Pelosi and McConnell and so forth, and President Obama, they can agree on the extraordinary service of Dr. Billington.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think that is a fittingly optimistic note in the macro sense on which to conclude, and certainly very befitting of the service of Jim Billington, who once again I would ask everyone to just join in thanking him for joining us today, the Billington family, this panel for doing such fitting honor to him. Thank you all.